Reforms. So, starting off, a big part of the reforms was the Second Great Awakening, which was a Protestant religious revival during the early 19th century in the United States. And the causes were enlightenment, a rise in thinking through reason, and rationality over emotion. And some of the effects were a rise in church attendance, and then the Baptist and Methodist Church began to rise. And the leader of the Second Great Awakening was Charles Grandison Finney, who was originally a lawyer but became a Presbyterian minister and kind of started the old Second Great Awakening. It was kind of a role model for it. And he preached the idea of religious revival all across the United States, and he kind of gets credit for it.
Another big movement that was shifting in the 18th century was abolition, and this went hand in hand with the growth of slavery. So as the economy was growing, the need for slaves did as well in the South, and the invention of the cotton gin definitely catalyzed this and made the need for slaves just skyrocket as to what it was before. So despite them not being able to get more slaves from overseas, the domestic trade still flourished, and in the South, abolition grew over time as well as people saw how they were treated, and most of the abolitionists were religiously motivated. However, there were also some that just had ethnic motives, and so one of the most famous abolitionists was Frederick Douglass. He was born around 1818 in Talbot, Maryland, and he doesn't know the exact date, but he was born to a Native American mother and an African American father. And he was born into slavery and bounced around between many farmers until he was sent to Edward Covey's farm. And Edward Covey apparently beat him and was very cruel to his slaves. So he escaped and took refuge with David Ruggles, who sheltered him. And later he became well known for writing the North Star, which is the paper that Frederick Douglass wrote and published in Rochester, New York. It focused on multiple oppressed groups such as women and other immigrant poor workers, and it had a slight religious influence. And it later merged with the Liberty Party paper of Syracuse, New York, and was renamed Frederick Douglass's paper.
Some more famous writers of abolition. One was William Lloyd Garrison. He was an abolitionist, a journalist, a suffragist, and a social reformer. And he was most known for writing the abolitionist paper, The Liberator. And then another one was Henry David Thoreau, who is an essayist, poet, philosopher, abolitionist, naturalist, and a tax resistor. And he was most known for his famous article, Civil Disobedience. And The Liberator was a weekly abolitionist newspaper. It was by William Lloyd Garrison. It was most religious rather than political, and it appealed to the moral conscience of readers, urging and suggesting them to demand the freeing of slaves.
So, women also played a huge role, such as Dorothea Lynn Dix. Dorothea Lynn Dix was most famously known as a nurse who fought for the rights of individuals with mental illnesses. She helped change people's perceptions of these populations. Dorothea Dix was also a social reformer who was dedicated to improving the treatment of the mentally ill and the health conditions of prisons. She created the first generation of American mental asylums. The Grimke sisters, Sarah Grimke and her sister Angela Grimke, both had antipathy toward both slavery and the limitations of the rights of women. In 1821, Sarah became acquainted with the Society of Friends, and in 1835, Angela wrote a letter of approval to William Lloyd Garrison that he published in his newspaper, The Liberator. Lucretia Mott was a 19th century feminist activist, abolitionist, social reformer, and pacifist who helped launch the women's rights movement. She co-wrote the Declaration of Sentiments in 1848 for the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. The Declaration of Sentiments was signed by 32 men and 68 women. It demands that women get the same rights as men and that society would acknowledge those rights. It was a controversial document but became the basis for the 19th Amendment, in which women received the right to vote in 1920. The Seneca Falls Convention was the first women's rights convention in the U.S. It fought for the civil, social, and religious rights of women. The conference took place in Seneca Falls, New York, in July 1848. The meeting launched the women's suffrage movement.
Eli Whitney, American inventor best known for the cotton gin. He developed the concept of mass production and interchangeable parts. He grew up on a farm and loved machine work and technology. The cotton gin was invented by Eli Whitney. It helped remove seeds and husks from cotton fiber. It resulted in greater availability and cheaper cloth, though increased the number of slaves to pick cotton. Effects of the cotton gin: the pros are it reduced the labor of removing seeds and it became extremely profitable. The cons are increased demand for slaves and increased demand for land. Joseph Smith, he was an American religious leader. He was a founder of Mormonism and the Latter-day Saint movement. He published the Book of Mormon. The Mormon Trail was a 1,300-mile route that the member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints traveled. After Joseph Smith was murdered, the church members realized that their settlement was becoming increasingly untenable. It starts in Nuevo, Illinois, and ends in Salt Lake City, Utah.
And their citations.